So we start the new year with this beautiful solemnity of Mary, Mother of God. In the gospel, it talks about the shepherds coming to see the Lord, and then they go off praising God for what they have seen. They reflect on what they've seen, and they go off and praise God. And Mary is exposed to all of these things that have happened, and she reflects on them in her heart. And how do we know that? How do we know that she reflects on these things in her heart? Most likely through St. Luke, because he's the one that tells us. And I'll just bet that he sat and spoke with her perhaps for hours. Tell me about Jesus. Tell me about his life in the home. Tell me about these things that you've held in your heart these years. All these things that you were exposed of, things, these wonders, these amazing things that have happened. She reflected on them in her heart. We are called to be reflective people. And I hope we begin this year with a heart of reflection. Maybe we journal. Maybe we spend time in adoration. Maybe we spend time in silence reflecting. They were concerned about us, and I think about this morning as I received an email from my former president rector of Mundelein Seminary, Father John Canary. I asked him if he would consider, he's now retired, considering to come out here to sunny and warm Phoenix, because he's from Chicago, to cover for Father Shea while he takes some vacation towards the middle and end of this month. And poor guy, he's down in Florida for 2 months. I'm thinking, again, another insight came to me this morning, because even though I was under his authority, he also taught a class on St. John of the Cross that I never took when I was at Mundelein. And I thought to myself, now maybe when he's done in Florida, we could get him to come out here and teach a class for maybe 2 nights, or in the daytime for the retired folks and nighttime for the working folks, for 2 days on John of the Cross. Wonderful teacher, a very reflective man. He would begin each quarter of our academic year with the reflection. I remember my first year there and the first winter that hit, and he stood up and he gave us a talk, a reflection about, now that it's cold, you can see far, right? Because the leaves have fallen off the trees and the air is very crisp and clear. But I think about that now as he escapes that winter down in Florida. Wonderful man. I think it'll be great to get him to come out here, and maybe some others that I got to know over the years in my formation that are very reflective people, to share that with you. And in my studies at Mundelein, we had a class on theological reflection, because they wanted us to be reflective priests, that we just weren't human doings, that we were human beings as priests, that we would go through life and we would anoint somebody, and then maybe later in that day would reflect upon what had taken place. And we had to write these reflections and so forth. For me, I don't know why. Maybe it's because I grew up in an alcoholic family. I don't know, but I am a very reflective person. I mean, I spent a great deal of yesterday in reflection because I was outdoors, and I spent a lot of time in silence, And, my life isn't typical of the people sitting in the pews. Most of you have families, you've got a lot of things that are going on, but we are called to be reflective. And I think about that over the course of this last year. Now we've started this new year. This last year has been one of the toughest years in my priesthood, the toughest year since, say, 2012. 2012 was a very rough year, and even the year that preceded that was very rough for me, and probably the toughest in my priesthood, and very bumpy, and very difficult, and very challenging. And the year ended for me here at St. Timothy's. And I started my first day here on 12/12/12, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And in many senses, I felt pretty beat up from my previous assignment. I get here, and A wonderful lady. And some would say, oh, I'm noticing race and that's not politically correct. I think it's a beautiful thing. A black lady came up and gave me a kiss on the cheek my first day here and said, welcome to St. Timothy's. I felt so loved and still do. And I thought, okay, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And that transition here was very good. It was very good. And then, I have been reflecting these last few months on how difficult this last year has been. The year started with a lot of fear for me regarding the changes that would take place here. And then the reality of what some of those changes would be, say, in April. And my fears for the people of St. Timothy and me, and the challenging times that I went through afterwards, and realizing those changes, and thinking of John of the Cross, I felt like I went through the dark night of the soul. And I felt like I started coming out of it in early October, although the situation and the struggles had not changed. And I remember talking to one of my priest friends downtown who works in the chancery. He says, Father John, you've been through all these things, but you are still standing. See, he walked with me through the difficulties of 2012. He walked that difficult road with me. He knows me, he knows my temperament, and he says, you're still standing. And I'm like, wow, how is that? How is that? It's through the grace of God, through some healing that maybe someday I will share with you. A lot of time in reflection and prayer. I want this year too, we can reflect on those difficult things. But I challenge us to, when we do, ask ourselves, how is God drawing good from this? How is God drawing good from this? And reflect on these things. Now, you heard me share this a few months ago, and I was in a bad place at that time. When these little gems come our way, I want us to reflect on these things. I've been carrying this in my Magnificat since, to remind me that these little nuggets come to us, and sometimes we're tempted to just blow it off and not reflect and not see how God is speaking to us through all these things, and maybe even sometimes using a sense of humor to do so. So I was parked at the diocese for the White Mass. I didn't get to go to the White Mass, but I got to go to the dinner. And I pull into the underground parking structure, and there's a really nice Jeep parked there. It's white. It's got like a 6-inch lift, 35 to 37-inch tires. And I parked my Jeep, and mine looks a little dwarfed compared to his. And I just parked, and I went in. I never saw the guy. Had dinner with some very treasured friends. Got to speak to Father Charlie, really for the first time in months at that time. Told him about my dark night of the soul. And I went out to my Jeep, and there was this note on my windshield. You probably heard this at a previous Mass. But I don't want us to blow these things off and say, I don't need to reflect. No, these are things that God gives us in the midst of struggle and trial to lift us up. And we think these are small things, but they're what? Dear Father, this is Matt from the Jeep next to you. We are from St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in Avondale. You have the coolest car of any priest in the diocese. These are things to reflect upon. This is one of the ways that God gets our attention. We don't want to walk through life or run through life as a human doing and not a human being. So we need to be. We need to be. We need, like Mary, to reflect on these things in our heart. What is God saying to me? Sometimes we need help from spiritual people. That doesn't necessarily mean a priest. Gosh, I tell you, the folks that have walked this road I sat down with them, and one of them was just saying, look how everything has fallen into place over these last 6 months. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And when you are a reflective person, when you're going through the trials, you will ask the Lord, you will ask yourself, and you may ask your spiritual friends, do you think this is happening for a reason? Mary obviously asked these questions. She didn't know. My son keeps talking about this passion, this suffering. What do you think it means? And of course, she walked the road with him. We see her in many places in the gospel where she's there, she's waiting outside, she's there at the foot of the cross. Your mother and your sisters and your brothers are outside, we would hear. She pondered these things in her heart. We are called to ponder. If we're not reflective people, I invite you as we enter into the new year to pull in the brakes, hit the brakes, pull in the reins, and maybe sit down and do a little writing, sit down and do a little pondering. Shut the radio off when you're driving. Shut it off. And just let the silence speak to you. Friends, Mary reflected upon all these little things in her heart. And we are called to do the same.